like how, oops, um, you know, I try to vet how they got the inspector's information.
I typically will ask them as well, do you have a preferred inspector? And most times they don't. Um, and then I'll follow up with, I have a preferred company. I trust them. I've used them on almost all of my buyers. I can give you their information. Otherwise, if you'd like, if this offer is accepted, I can set up that inspection for you, because I usually do it for them. I don't know if you do too, but I always set it up for them just so I know when it is, so I can make sure I can be there at the summary portion of it. But yeah, I've never really had pushback on who I use.
I don't get a lot of pushback either.
I don't ever just give one person, like same with a lender, because if something were to go wrong, then I've had others experience to say, well, you told me they were good. And then this has happened, or, XYZ. So to take any liability off of myself, I give a few, like 3 probably. And I just say, I have a few inspectors that I know past clients have used and loved. I'm happy to share those with you, and then you can decide who you want to use from there. I don't ever want to be the person to be like, use this company, and then it goes shit in a handbasket, and then they're looking at me.
I love that.
I do the same, but what I'll also do is I always check to make sure which ones are available. So then I'll say, here's the list of the inspectors. This one is available on Monday. This one's available on Wednesday. This one. And I try, if I can, to, and then I tell them, obviously, my experience, but I too also try to match the buyer if I can. I mean, I'll always give them additional ones, but obviously in my preferred ones, I know certain inspectors will mesh better with certain clients. So there's nothing worse than when they don't, because that could set it off on a bad tone too. So I give them all, but then base it on, hey, this one's available first. Give them a call, see if you like it. If so, and we've got a 3-day inspection. We don't have a lot of wiggle room. So I always make sure that they have the other ones, but they know which ones, that I've worked with.
Okay, that's good feedback. I do think it's important, that it's inspectors you're recommending are inspectors that you've had a chance to kind of learn their communication style. And I support what Ashley said. I always give a recommendation of at least 2 inspectors. I'm not afraid to say that not all inspectors are created equal, just like not all realtors are created equal. And we want this to be an informative inspection, or for them to get what they need out of it. And regardless, you're paying someone to kind of find things with the home. They're either looking for maintenance items to put on a list that the homeowner will need to take care of going forward, or they're identifying big safety issues that we need to address. And again, that's customized to kind of Ashley's list of the type of inspection that we are going into and setting the tone for that. But we've seen so many inspectors out there where, because it's not regulated in Minnesota, they're just going to come in and, they see a spider in the basement and tell you got to burn the house down. So make sure that you're working with reputable companies that, they're all third party, but the goal is to support the client without freaking the client out about things that come up on the house. So.
Yeah. You're nice, right? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Nicole. If you want to pull up her screen.
Can you go back to the slide?
Yep, I'm going to pull those up right now.
Oh, did you do your second?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you did. Okay, so I'm kind of taking over, like, once the inspection's completed and we've listened to the summary with the home inspector, and we've actually gotten the report and taken time to go through it. How do you have the conversation with the buyer as far as what they think of the inspection? Like, I don't necessarily volunteer my opinion right away up front. I typically ask the buyer first, like, how do you feel like the inspection went overall? And then wait to hear their response. And then based on their response, we address any concerns that they have. If they don't really give much of a response, then I kind of guide them through it. Say like, okay, typically in an inspection, we focus on major health and safety related or any major mechanical concerns. Like, is there anything that you think came up during the home inspection that, would raise any red flags for these issues? And, I kind of emphasize like, we're not looking for cosmetic defects unless it's something extremely significant. We're focusing on health and safety related items. And some of it too depends on the type of financing that they're getting. So like if they are getting FHA or VA financing, are there any concerns that came up in the inspection that may be an issue in either of those financing programs? So we have an open dialogue, like whether there's any health and safety related items. And then we talk like, hey, are there any other concerns that you have with the house? Talk through any of that kind of stuff. And then obviously my answers or my responses vary based on what they're saying. I typically don't volunteer information unless I have a very significant concern. In that case, I'll say something like, hey, during the review of the inspection, he mentioned this. How do you feel about this? Does this concern you? Things like dryer vents. That's something super common that we see a lot, like the wrong kind of dryer vent tubing. GFCIs, and what actually is involved in replacing those, or adding them if they don't already exist. There are some times where, reading through a report, maybe an inspector doesn't bring something up during the review and something catches my eye, like say there's deterioration on the deck or the ledger board isn't supported correctly, the deck's not supported correctly or something's not attached correctly or whatever. Like it just really varies and it depends what it is, where like maybe I know that the repair is a little bit more costly than what the buyer may think that it is. And I'll volunteer those things because I certainly don't want it to bite them afterwards. And it also really depends on like what the situation was that we got the house under, right? So kind of like what Angie said, like what did we tell the seller up front our terms of the inspection were? Like just as an example, I was helping a buyer buy a house in Farmington and we went for the original showing. It's a military buyer. My buyers were out of state. So I was there by myself for the showing and they were on FaceTime. And I didn't really, I could tell that the carpet was not super clean, but I didn't think that there were any strong odors or anything in the house. But the windows were open. When we went back for the inspection, the windows were now shut and there was significant pet odor in the house. And I just said, look, you guys, you're not here, so I can't necessarily get your opinion on this, but I need to tell you that this is an issue, right? So here I have somebody that's never been in the house before, and I'm 100% their eyes and ears. And nose. Yeah. And I had to say something, right? I can't just ignore that isn't a problem. I ended up calling the listing agent and I said, who I knew, right? So I already had an existing relationship there, which was helpful. But I said, hey, when we viewed the house, I didn't notice this. And I think it's because the windows were open, going back into the house now, there's a significant odor. And he goes, yeah, the seller's aware and she's prepared to compensate for that. And I was like, oh, okay, not a problem. So we ended up negotiating $10,000 in flooring, but there really weren't a whole lot of other issues with the house. So things like that do and can happen. So it just really varies property to property. Does anybody have any like specific examples that they want to walk through, or questions that they have, or things that they're currently seeing in inspections that they want to talk about?
I just want to add that I really love the line that Nicole uses here down at the bottom of her slide where she says, "Did you notice XYZ? How do you feel about that?" Before she's chiming in with her opinion, she is getting a feel for whether or not this is an issue to the buyer, right? She's not creating an issue where an issue doesn't exist. She's representing her client. She's pointed out an issue and she's letting them decide how it affects them. This is top-notch information you're getting on how to move forward with inspections, because no matter what house you inspect, whether it is 100 years old or it was just completed 2 days ago, inspectors are going to find something. And it's all about how you're coaching your clients through this. Good job, Nicole.
So before we started using Marigold, I used a home inspection company that I actually really liked. I never had any major issues with them. Parker had some major issues with them. And I was like, I don't think that this is about the inspector. I think it's about agent training and how an agent discusses a home inspection with a buyer. And just like Jelena said, like, this is one of the main things that I do that I don't know how many other agents do. Inspections can be deal breakers for buyers, but I think it's so much about the emotion that the agent puts into it. And if you talk very matter-of-factly about the concerns about the house and what's involved in making the repairs, or find out if it is even a concern. Somebody might have a brother that's an HVAC person and doesn't care if there's a 20-year-old furnace, right? Like, it can be very different depending on the buyer's situation. So just assuming that everyone's going to think that a 20-year-old furnace is like the end of the world is not a good approach, because every single buyer is different. They might have a brother that's an electrician. They might have an uncle that's an HVAC guy. They might have somebody in their family that's a roofer. And like, it may completely be a non-issue. So I always take the approach that every situation is a unique situation. I don't necessarily know what the buyer's resources are. And, I'll say things like, did you notice, or how do you feel about? Because those statements leave it completely open-ended for them to tell you how they feel. Mm-hmm. And I have very few deals fall apart because of inspections.
And what she's
I
doing
was just
a good
gonna
job of in this too is you're meeting your requirement for disclosure, Nicole, by doing it exactly this way. This is a perfect script, everyone, for how you should be handling any inspection that you're out there negotiating with your clients. Just by saying, did you notice XYZ? Are you concerned about that at all? Using those language, she's fulfilling her obligation and duty to her client in disclosure, but she is ultimately letting the client have the say on how they want to move forward. If the client comes back and asks for recommendations, she can deal with that at that time. You can deal with that at that time. But don't make assumptions like she's been saying, because you don't always know the circumstances behind the scene or relationships or someone who just loves to do repairs on a house. Give your client the opportunity to decide for themselves how they feel about issues that come up and how they want to move them forward.
Great job.
Yep. Thanks.
I was just going to add in, this is where also establishing that relationship, whether you've met them once or 20 times, to be able to have those conversations. Like, I try to always have the conversation of, when the report comes, this is what, may or may not be, and kind of feel them out before, because they could be having a bad day on that given day, and that report may be the thing that just tips them over the edge. But if you know what you previously discussed, you can kind of bring it back there. And a lot of times that'll help them go, oh, that's right, and then it brings it back. So just kind of having those consults before is so important. prior to like the more tense moments.
Yeah. Any questions?
I have two little things to add. So I try to gear them if there's a lot of electrical or a lot of one thing, I try to kind of gear towards like one trade, because the seller's more likely to potentially do fixes if we have to have a plumber out or an electrician out and not like 5 different people.
Yeah.
Kind of try to group together where the majors are, and kind of loop them into a trade. And I think it's really important on certain things to make sure you're writing licensed professional, licensed plumber, licensed electrician, seller to provide paid receipts 1 week prior to closing. Because if you don't, it can be handyman special and that satisfies the request. So and the
Yeah,
other
I'm hoping that Ian goes over some of that next.
sorry, okay.
That's
my
okay.
other small thing was gonna say, when you're asking for, so say like the countertop or something is cracked and you want them to don't ever, I never would advise to repair, because they're gonna find the shittiest thing on Craigslist they could find. So if it's cosmetic stuff like that, I always recommend a price reduction or seller credit. Okay, but that's all
Anything else? I think we could move to Ian. Ian. If there's anything different. Didn't your grandpa call you Ian?
For the first like year and a half of my life, he called me Ian. So.
That's where I got that, because you told us that.
It's close enough. You can call me whatever you want. My grandma called me Tyler. Nice, Taylor. Yeah, so my portion here, what I wanted to focus on is negotiating that inspection with the listing agent and the seller. And really, it doesn't matter what we're asking for necessarily. What I want to talk about is how we present that and how we can be the problem solver when there are problems to deal with, and how I approach that situation, and how we can continue to move forward and get that contract pending, right? So the approach I really take is I want the listing agent working with me or for me and not against me, right? And so here are a couple points that they're probably the biggest tools that I use to make sure I get out of that inspection period and my buyers are able to come away with a win as well. So this is at the point in which we are either asking for repairs or we're asking for closing costs. We have an inspection amendment on the table. So first and foremost, make sure you're keeping your emotions out of it. Inspections are emotional. They're emotional for buyers because obviously it's stressful. They're buying a house and now they get a huge report of what's wrong with the property, right? And the sellers too, I mean, it's stressful for them as well. Obviously, they're moving out of their home, and sellers have options these days too. So sometimes negotiations can be a little bit tough. Sellers can be a little bit greedy because, you know, they have 9 other backup offers on the table, whatever it is. So just make sure that you are that agent that is going to be the voice of reason. You're managing those emotions, and you're doing that by using logic, right? You're that problem solver in this situation. So never be that agent that's going to argue with the other party, argue with the other agent, and obviously don't show those emotions to your buyers either. And one of the best tools that I use to chat with the listing agent is I build rapport with them exactly the same way I would with a client. And you should really start that approach as soon as you send that offer out the door. And that conversation, that dialogue, it doesn't end with the acceptance of an offer. So through the inspection period, I'm still listening to their tone. I'm reading them. If they're a high eye, you know, I'm coming up a little bit. I'm answering the phone. Hey, how was your weekend? Did you do anything fun? Did you get to spend time with your family? You know, if they're a little more direct, straight to the point, I'm giving them the facts. And like I said, I'm reading them the same way I would as a client and building that rapport as much as I really can. So read their tone. And whether they know it or not, I mean, an approach I like to take is I like to be agreeable. So not everybody might agree with this, but when I'm having the conversation with the listing agent, if we're asking for repairs, I put the blame on my buyer a little bit and I'll say, hey, I know we're asking for 4 or 5 items here. Let's see what we can do on this. Anything I can do to lay our requests down gently with them. Because if I come in swinging and I'm up in arms and I'm saying, well, this needs to get fixed because of this, and this needs to get fixed because of that, I promise you that conversation, that listing agent, when they're bringing that to their sellers, it's probably going to be in the same tone or close to it. So make sure that you're still having a good dialogue and a good conversation with the listing agent. Feel free to put that blame on your buyers. I mean, we really are just a conduit to our clients, right? So my clients want this. This is really important to them. Let's see what we can do here. And so that kind of leads me into my next point too, is just empathize with the sellers and with the listing agent too. Put yourself in their shoes, and then also set those expectations with your buyers. I know that kind of leads back into Nicole's point, and Nicole's slide last time too. But prep them and say, hey, if we're asking for X, Y, Z, if you were a seller, these 2 items are probably important. This one maybe isn't. So when they come back and say, hey, we're willing to fix these 2 and not this one, and some of that comes with experience too, you prepped your buyers for that already. So getting out of that inspection and having your buyers be like, okay, we were kind of prepped for this. That conversation is just so much easier, right? And then, yeah, something else I wanted to mention too, with just empathizing with the sellers and the listing agent, and just some scripts that I like to use is, I know that the sellers might think that we're asking for a lot here, but these items are very important to my buyers in order to move forward. Let me know what we can do in order to pen this thing. It once again, it lays that down gently, whatever those requests are that you're asking. And it's also indicating to the listing agent that you're a solution-driven agent and that you can get this thing to the finish line. So it really just opens that door a little bit to continue the negotiations rather than shutting it down. So it's important to convey to the listing agent that you're going to do what it takes to come to terms with whatever that inspection amendment looks like, right? And then another little script that I like to add with every single inspection amendment that I send out is I say, thanks in advance, or something along the lines of, thanks so much for your efforts on this. Looking forward to moving this to pending with you. I'm already thanking them for the fact that they have to go back to their sellers, ask for $6,000 in seller paid closing costs, whatever it is. Just anything I can do to make that conversation a little bit lighter and make sure that, like I said, the listing agent is working with me or for me and not against me. I'm planting those seeds wherever I really can. And yeah, I mean, that kind of leads me to my last point, is just one of the biggest things to remember is we are rowing in the same direction. The buyers want to buy the property, the sellers want to sell it, and there's currently a gap. How can we be the problem solver in this situation, and how can we close that gap and move this thing to pending? And I mean, those are really that's the approach I take. I know some agents might not agree with that fully, but to Nicole's point, I mean, it's very, very rare that I have a deal fall through during an inspection period. Does anybody have any questions, anything that they are curious about, any dialogue that you guys want to talk about, anything like that? Does anybody approach this differently?
We should maybe go back and, I mean, does anyone have any questions? Otherwise, we should kind of go back and talk about what Kelly mentioned earlier about requiring licensed contractors and receipts and stuff like that.
Hey, Ian, it's Amy.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, what do you say to, like, how do you prep your clients? Like, we're probably not going to get these 5 things. I mean, do you just tell them straight up?
Yeah, I mean, it totally depends what it is, and it depends what else we have on the table. So usually how I direct that conversation is I say, what's most important to you and what's a deal breaker for you? What needs to get done in order for us to move forward in the transaction? And yeah, I mean, some of that can be a little bit more of a tactical negotiation skill, where I said, you know, we want these 3 items. Let's even throw in the 2 that aren't deal breakers, because just the psychology of it, the sellers are going to come back and we already know that they're going to cross those 2 off their list, right? So
Yep,
that kind of
totally.
gets really into the meat and potatoes of it. But that's an approach I take too. Yeah.
The other
Cool,
thing too
thanks.
is whether you have radon results back yet. Like if you've done a radon test, but you don't have the results back yet, and you're talking to the buyer about the inspection as a whole, you can be like, okay, we can have this conversation, but we really need to know what the radon results are before we make a formal request to the seller. And if the radon test does come back high and it needs to be mitigated, like that's a health and safety related item. Are there any of these other items that you're less concerned about? Right. So you kind of prep your buyer in advance for like, okay, if radon comes back high, then we might have to let go of some of these other things depending on how serious they are.
I love that you quantify that, Nicole. I do the same thing. I think that's very smart to do. And this is where experience and, you know, taking time to really learn a lot of details about real estate and houses can come in handy, because you're able to propose solutions sometimes that maybe the buyer hasn't thought of before that they would be willing to take on. When it comes to radon, I always look for if the basement is finished or not. And if it's not finished, I talk about personal experience, both working in construction and my personal home, where sealing, pressing your foundation, hydraulic cement, going to cost you 20 to 30 bucks at Home Depot, can drop your radon levels below the threshold. You know, is that something they would be willing to consider instead of asking for a large item like radon mitigation if there were other things on the inspection list that were more important to them? So just knowing things about houses gives you an opportunity to kind of quantify, I guess, where they are on the importance scale for your buyer. And then also asking if they're willing, you know, to lose the house over said repair. Are you willing to pass on this house if they're not going to do this, you know, repair that you could go down to Menards or Home Depot and fix for yourself for $100? Just to kind of put some perspective on it, but that takes researching real estate and, you know, learning as you go through these inspections on what those repairs cost. So just a little feedback.
Yeah. So back to Kelly's point about some of the wording in an inspection amendment. Number one, make sure you're writing an amendment, not an addendum, because you're making changes to the original contract. So it's got to be an addendum. No, sorry, it's got to be an amendment. And then writing things in there, like, especially if it's electrical, you know, it could be plumbing, it could be a roof repair, anything like that. You want to have a licensed contractor complete those repairs and have seller provide the receipts at least 1 week prior to closing. And title companies, depending on what the repair is, may ask for lien waivers. Does everybody know what a lien waiver is? Okay, I'm just going to tell you. So a lien waiver is a separate document that a contractor will sign that says that the seller does not owe any money towards this repair, that the repair is paid for in full, and that the contractor will not come back and file a lien against the property. And it's a mechanic's lien. So any work that's done on a property prior to closing, if it's not fully paid for, the contractor could potentially come back and file a mechanic's lien against the property, and a lien goes with the property, not with the person. So it could either put your buyer in a situation where now they're having to pay for work that was done as part of your purchase agreement, which it could probably be fought and the seller would be required to pay for it, but you're just avoiding a lot of issues if you do this stuff up front. And if you're using Flex Title, they're very thorough about this kind of stuff. So you hopefully get to closing without any issues, but it's important to put that kind of wording in your inspection amendment.
And along those lines, Nicole, there are a couple clauses that we have available for inserting into your amendments. So go ahead and look at those on PHT agent resources. I know under clauses, we have a few different options there wording wise. You can put, I always put a clause into every one of my inspection amendments that I write. And then as far as lien waivers go, a paid receipt is not a lien waiver. I know that Nicole's touched on this, but just so everybody knows, someone handing you a paid receipt is not equal to a lien waiver. And Flex Title does have a blank form for us to use if needed, where we can just provide that to the contractor or to the sell side so that they can have those filled out. And it's usually any repair valued, I believe, over $500 where it's required. So just get in a good habit of using that and ask your sales coordinators if you have questions on what that process looks like.
Any questions about lien waivers? Are we, where are we at with the slides? Are we done?
I think so.
We are all set with slides. It is 11:45, so if we just do kind of a brief recap, I guess, unless anyone else has any questions. Angie, do you want to do a quick kind of recap, bullet points of what you talked about?
Sure. Yeah. So when you are writing an offer, depending on what inspection you've decided to do with your buyer, the main four that I focus on are just a standard inspection without any caveats. Just decide on how many days you want to have. You can waive the inspection altogether, or you can do the monetary cap, or do a pass-fail inspection.
Great. Okay, Nicole, how about just quick recap of your scripting?
Yeah, I think number one thing is just not assuming that a buyer feels a certain way about an issue and just asking them, you know, how do you feel about the inspection overall? Or, you know, I noticed X, Y, and Z. How do you feel about this issue?
Great. And Ian, how about you? You want to do a quick recap?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, when you're negotiating that inspection with the listing agent, just keep in mind, you want them to work with you or for you. And the best way to do that is one, to keep your emotions out of it, use logic, be the solution-driven agent, build rapport with the listing agent, just like you would with the client. Like I said, you guys are rowing in the same direction. Even though you have a few things that you need to negotiate, whether it's closing costs or repairs, you guys are rowing in the same direction. So just make sure that you are that solution driven agent. And then, yeah, that last part too is just make sure, it kind of goes back to what Nicole said, is just make sure you're setting those expectations with your buyers as you move forward too. And it's really the best way to get out of that inspection period is to keep your emotions out of it, use logic, and find the solution.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everybody, for your contributions today. We've got like 2 minutes left if anyone has a last minute question that or something they'd like to add.
I have one really super quick. One other thing that I've done successfully a good amount of times is if we're doing price reduction or seller pays or doing money, I always come up together with the buyer, like what is a good number, what would be a number that you'd be happy with. Then I go back to the agent and usually double that number. And a lot of times they say yes, and then you're like a hero. So I always go above whatever we discuss.
The other thing too that I do that I guess we didn't really touch on, and now that I'm thinking about it, is if there's a significant repair that my buyer wants, I typically encourage them to ask for it in the form of seller paid closing costs instead of having the seller make the repair, because then the buyer has control over how the work is actually done and that it's done in a professional manner that they think is acceptable. Like the last thing that you want to happen is that a seller makes a repair and you get to the house for your final walkthrough and it looks like absolute garbage because the seller did it like as cheap as humanly possible. And your buyers just aren't happy with the way that the repair was made. So I don't reduce the purchase price either unless we've already asked for seller paid closing costs, because seller paid closing costs will give your buyer a direct dollar for dollar impact on their cash to close, helping them reserve the funds after closing to make those repairs, whereas reducing a purchase price does not do that. So like I want my buyer to have the money left over after closing to actually make the repair. So that's why we do seller pays instead of reducing a purchase price.
Good point. That's a conversation you can have with your clients up front too, setting the tone going into inspection. Or when you're writing an offer on a property, if you're writing it contingent to inspection and they're not asking for full closing costs, you're leaving some room there in the event something does come up on inspection that they would like to negotiate in that way. So
Can you say that again, Nicole, why you have them do it that way?
Yeah, so seller paid closing costs reduce the cash that the buyer is bringing to the closing table.
Oh, okay.
So like say your closing costs are going to be $10,000, but you have a $3,000 repair that needs to be made. If you ask the seller to pay $3,000 towards the buyer's closing costs, now they're only bringing $7,000 to closing, and it's saving them $3,000 that they can use after closing to make the repair.
sounds good. Thanks again for highlighting that point. Appreciate everybody attending. We got about 10 minutes until our team meeting, so we will see everybody there. Thank you. Remember that if you have questions that come up with your inspection at all, go to your sales coordinators. They are experienced, they have knowledge, they've worked through all sorts of scenarios with their clients. Obviously, this is collaborative training today where we've got different viewpoints and tactics, but I think a common theme is that all four of us hosting the training today have used a lot of these similar tactics, and so our experience tells us we know that this is the best way to do it and that it works. I hope you found some good takeaways, but again, if you have questions that come up as you're negotiating your deals, feel free to reach out to your sales coordinator so they can help you with those things. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.